So, without further ado, we have the pleasure and the privilege to have with us Ruslan, Stefanov, then Mike Carpenter, then Ruslan, Plevneliev, the former president, and Trykov. And I believe that we'll be able to have a very succinct sort of debate, very forthright. So, Ruslan, le floor is yours, as the French would say.
Thanks, thank you, Leon, and I'm honored to actually be able to present in front of so many distinguished speakers after me. And I'm standing on the shoulders of giants because I'm going to present CSD's work in the past 5 or 6 years on Russian economic footprint in Europe and why it matters. I think Torsten already and Ognian outlined a lot of the issues that we want to focus on and that everybody is free to ignore. But in a way, we think that there is enough evidence that there is a Kremlin playbook and that we should heed how it unfolds and we should know the risks that it bears with. I'm going to have a brief overview of the economic presence of Russia in Europe, also zooming in on the Balkans, on Central Eastern Europe and Balkans. These are the areas that CSD has looked at, and I'm going to focus in particular on this nexus that we call the state capture mechanism through which Russia has been able to exert its influence across Europe. And we're going to speak about some of the aspects or some of the risk aspects that are out there that we want to turn to. Now, without much ado, I would like to just say a few words about how do we see the virtuous cycle of Kremlin's influence and how does this state capture model function. Torsten already mentioned one important distinction between what we have in Europe as a division between private economy and state, and that it doesn't exist in authoritarian regimes like Russia or China. And that is one of the central things that we need to bear in mind. And we get this question constantly. Okay, so how do you discern between opportunity, so country going after, so private capital going after opportunities, investing in Europe, and this capital being linked to some influence? And we say, well, that's exactly the issue. We don't know. And actually what we've seen in the past decade in Russia is that these lines of division between business interests and the state have been blurred effectively by a lot of direct influence by the Kremlin on both state-owned and also private businesses. So if we look at the structure of the Russian economy, you'll see, first of all, huge concentration in state-owned, in particularly energy assets, but what you will see is that there is effectively no wall between politics and the Kremlin and business. And that makes a problem with all the investments that we see, because at any point in time, this blurring of the boundary between the state and the business allows for opportunities for business to be exploited for political influence. And I think people that have seen here in the region, we've talked a lot about, we've tried to expand this discussion, they will notice that it's actually not very easy to speak about Russia. People are really more readily speaking about China and other authoritarian regimes, but somehow it's not easy to find people to actually stand up and say, well, we think these are the investments and they have certain issues, and particularly when they engage with the local vulnerabilities, that are the lack of rule of law or the certain deficiencies in the systems that we have. Now, let me outline briefly all these different aspects of why do we think we deal with rule of law issue on our side and with a specific concept of state capture on the Russian side. When we look at the factors enabling Russia's economic influence in Europe, we have to take into consideration what Ognian already mentioned. Now, if you think of it, different studies put it at different levels, but there is almost unanimous agreement that there is at least 1 trillion outflow of investments from Russia into the, so what we call the Western, so US and Europe financial system. Now, this outflow, of course, not all of it is, and actually probably a little portion of it is meant to peddle influence. But what has happened is, we look at it nominally, but it has developed. It has been part of networks of former security services. It has been part of networks that are effectively, even today, run by Russia's security services. And that makes it very potently malign. And this is the problem with it. The continuing control, or the increasing control of the Kremlin over these flows of funds actually makes us oblivious to how big is the risk that we are facing. Because we are not used to looking at this hard power instrument, the economy. But when it comes to, when it's linked to effectively controlled by the state, then that makes it a problem. Now, a lot of business assets in strategic sectors, I'll be talking about a little bit later about energy. There are also, and I think we all were shocked by the extent of money laundering scandals. I think we're just scratching the surface, though, because there's this 1 trillion that I'm talking to. It hasn't stayed like that. This is the nominal amount, but this is like over 30 years of time. It has developed into different capital networks, and it has expanded. And that's what we've tried to uncover. We've tried to look beyond the evident, beyond what our central banks are telling us about foreign direct investments coming from Russia. And I'm going to present a little bit more about that later on. I'm not going to go through all the slides. You can read the wonderful analysis that I showed, but let me just focus on a couple of examples coming from countries that we looked at in Western Europe. And these are the blue bars. This is what you're going to see if you look at the official statistics, because this shows the corporate footprint, or the direct corporate control of Russian entities in these 3 economies: Austria, Italy, and the Netherlands. But if you look at the indirect, so the whole picture of it, it will provide you with the risk. So this means all the revenues of companies, or the percentage of the revenues of the companies that are dependent, largely dependent on Russian markets, investment, or directly corporate controlled in these countries, that out of the whole economy, or out of the whole revenue of the country. And as you can see, these are quite sizable. And in different countries, we talk about different specifics. In the Netherlands, it is the lax regime of registering holding companies. Same applies for countries like Luxembourg, for Austria, but also for Cyprus. And people from Central and Eastern Europe know that huge amount of the investments that we actually get comes through these countries that I mentioned. In Austria, the issue is mostly with the banking system, where it has huge exposure to Russian assets. And actually, the figures that you see, they have increased in these countries after 2014, so after the sanctions were imposed. Now, you won't be able to discern this, but this is generally the footprint, so just the blue bars, but in Central and Eastern Europe and the Balkans. So the direct corporate control of revenues in these economies is much, much higher. So it's between 5 and 10%. It has been declining on the back of course, falling oil prices and so on and so forth, but still it is a sizable presence. And if you look at the case of Montenegro, which is the ones higher up, when Mr. Deripaska owned the aluminium plant, it went to close to 30%, so 1/3 of the economy. And this is not necessarily counting all the real estate stuff. Now, our kind moderator is nodding that I should speed things up to be able to finish on time. But let me just very briefly say that these investments, they're also focused, in particular in Central and Eastern Europe, in the Balkans, in strategic sectors. And let me say two of them that are very, very important. One is energy, and the other one is banking. I mean, if you look at the Balkans, you know, EU or non-EU members, you will see that a lot of critical energy assets are owned or controlled directly by Russian interests. Now, again, going back to the model of state capture, the real issue about this is that actually the Kremlin is able to use these assets whenever they find they want to. So they might not want to, or they might not wish to do it, but if they want to do it, they could certainly do so. And we've seen this thousands of examples on both how they use the state-owned companies like Gazprom or VTB, but also private companies like Lukoil. So no Chinese wall between the politics and business. I'm not going to go on the deficits that we've seen in the Balkans, but let me just give one specific example of a project and how this project has been linked to Russia's interests and how they've used this. We all know that for the past 15 years we've been talking about South Stream and Turk Stream. And you might remember in 2009 when the winter was extremely cold and the conflict between Ukraine and Russia left Bulgaria and Slovakia in the cold, and the EU decided to build the energy union. And then Mr. Putin came out with a counter-proposal saying, we'll do two strategic pipelines. One is Nord Stream, one is South Stream, that has been since then reincarnated in all different types of streams. And whatever we say about our sanctions and what we've done with, to tackle Russia while understanding about its influence in the various areas that, in Europe, what we can see today is that these two projects are still alive and well. So they move forward despite all the issues that we've mentioned, you know, the political interference, the directly chosen companies, so no competition in who's building what. This means not deciding competitively who is, how procurement is done, but deciding on the companies. Decision on the companies has already been made, which means a lot of profits might end up in the wrong hands. I think we're going to talk a lot of the sharpening, so to say, tools of the Russian or Kremlin's influence.
1 minute.
Just a couple of it, thank you. One is, of course, the old security service networks. This is, I mean, alive and well, usually at the center of these oligarchic networks, but also the use of media to spread disinformation. This vertically integrated response that Russia is able to deliver is really the one that creates a lot of issues, so both in the private and the public sectors. Now, let me just focus very briefly on a couple of recommendations, and I'm going to then say just two on the Balkans. We have looked at this, but if there has to be one thing, if we have to give one response, it has to be EU anti-money laundering agency or effort, sustained effort, you know, to understand the risks of these inflows of capital, but also to be able to tackle it without hurting economic opportunity. And that's important because if you look at the landscape of anti-money laundering in Europe, there are precious few countries that could actually do anything in that respect. And if we look at the Balkans, because it's been the area of interest where clearly Russia has opposed the EU and NATO future, then there it's clear that the EU at this point, I mean, if we look at the current, at the enlargement process, I would say that it is a very solid process. But what we need and what we lack as a European player there is the political tools to actually leverage this process. So to tell all these countries that if they don't get their act together, there will be consequences. And with that, I would like to finish my presentation. Urge you to read the policy brief that you have in your folders, which contains all these nice recommendations. Thank you.